Masonic landmarks are a set of principles that many Freemasons claim to be ancient and unchangeable precepts of Masonry. Issues of the regularity of a Freemasonic lodge, Grand Lodge, or Grand Orient are judged in the context of the landmarks. Because each Grand Lodge is self-governing, with no single body exercising authority over the whole of Freemasonry, the interpretations of these principles can and do vary, leading to controversies of recognition. Different Masonic jurisdictions have different landmarks. Over the past 200 years, several attempts have been made to codify and enumerate what constitutes a landmark. In this video, we will look at the list of 25 ancient, universal, and immutable landmarks identified by Dr. Albert G. Mackey and published in the American Quarterly Review of Freemasonry in 1858. It feels a little redundant to have to point this out after that introduction, but for those who are watching this video with the intent of finding evidence of whatever particular conspiracy or general scheme for world domination takes their fancy, please note: the landmarks presented are not universally agreed across the craft. There exists no universally agreed definition or list of what constitutes a landmark. And perhaps most importantly, Albert Mackey was writing in the mid-19th century, and his list reflects the times and the culture in which he lived. There are elements of his list which are frankly repugnant to modern ears, particularly Landmark 18. These elements have never held any particular authority within Freemasonry, but are of interest in their historical context and presented as such.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's presentation From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore.
Before moving on to Mackey's 25 landmarks, it is interesting to look at two more recent attempts to codify what a Mason means when he uses the cryptic phrase, the ancient landmarks of the order. In 1911, understanding Mackey's 25 points to be a summary of Masonic common law, the legal scholar Roscoe Pound, who lived from 1870 to 1964, distinguished 7 of them as landmarks. 1. Belief in a supreme being. 2. Belief in immortality. 3. That a book of the sacred law is an indispensable part of the furniture or furnishings of the lodge. 4. The legend of the third degree. 5. Secrecy, although not specifying what was being kept secret. 6. The symbolism of operative Masonry. And 7. That a Mason must be a man free-born and of lawful age. In the past century, several American Grand Lodges attempted to enumerate the landmarks, ranging from West Virginia, who found 7, New Jersey, who found 10, Nevada, who found 39, and Kentucky, who found a total of 54 landmarks. In the 1950s, the Commission on Information for Recognition of the Conference of Grand Masters of Masons in North America, there's a title, upheld 3 ancient landmarks. 1. Monotheism, an unalterable and continuing belief in God. 2. The volume of the sacred law, an essential part of the furniture of the lodge. And 3. Prohibition of the discussion of religion and politics within the lodge. That being said, let's have a look at Mackey's 25 landmarks. The 25 landmarks of Freemasonry, compiled by Dr. Mackey, are not universally accepted. Indeed, they are not really landmarks at all. For example, the system of 3 degrees of craft Freemasonry isn't a landmark. the third degree didn't exist at the time of the formation of the first Grand Lodge in England. Landmark 8 is also a controversial item in some jurisdictions. Landmark 14 is noteworthy since in some jurisdictions visiting is considered a privilege. Landmark 20 regarding resurrection raises theological questions which some jurisdictions feel unqualified to address. There are those brethren who still assign Mackey's landmarks a far greater value than they deserve. Although they do not represent any historical authority, but merely reflect the opinion of one antebellum American author, the counter-argument is made that the phrase ancient landmarks is a part of our ritual language, so it requires definition. The problem is reaching agreement on what are the landmarks. Before Mackey's list can be adopted by any jurisdiction, several issues would need to be addressed. Numbers 8, 20 and 25 are controversial. Numbers 4, 12 and 16 are ill-defined. Numbers 8, 9 and 14 are contrary to many constitutions. Number 18 is ambiguous and frankly repugnant. And number 25 is clearly wrong. What follows is the complete list of Mackey's 25 landmarks with a brief extract from his publication explaining his reasoning in his own words. The modes of recognition are, of all the landmarks, the most legitimate and unquestioned. They admit of no variation, and if ever they have suffered alteration or addition, the evil of such a violation of the ancient law has always made itself subsequently manifest. This is a landmark that has been better preserved than almost any other, although even here the mischievous spirit of innovation has left its traces, and by the disruption of its concluding portion from the third degree, a want of uniformity has been created in respect to the final teaching of the Master's Order, and the Royal Arch of England, Scotland, Ireland, and America, and the high degrees of France and Germany, are all made to differ in the mode in which they lead the neophyte to the great consummation of all symbolic masonry. In 1813, the Grand Lodge of England vindicated the ancient landmark by solemnly enacting that ancient craft masonry consisted of 3 degrees: entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason, including the Holy Royal Arch. This is an important landmark, the integrity of which has been well preserved. There is no rite of masonry practiced in any country or language in which the essential elements of this legend are not taught. The lectures may vary, and indeed are constantly changing, but the legend has ever maintained substantially the same, and it is necessary that it should be so, for the legend of the temple builder constitutes the very essence and identity of masonry. Any rite which should exclude it, or materially alter it, would at once, by that exclusion or alteration, cease to be a Masonic rite. Many persons ignorantly suppose that the election of the Grand Master is held in consequence of a law or regulation of the Grand Lodge. Such, however, is not the case. The office is indebted for its existence to a landmark of the order. Grand Masters, or persons performing the function under a different but equivalent title, are to be found in the records of the institution long before Grand Lodges were established. It is in consequence of this law, derived from ancient usage and not from any special enactment, that the Grand Master assumes the chair, or as it is called in England, the throne, at every communication of the Grand Lodge, and that he is also entitled to preside at the communication of every subordinate lodge where he may happen to be present. The statutory law of Masonry requires a month or other determinate period to elapse between the presentation of a petition and the election of a candidate. But the Grand Master has the power to set aside or dispense with this probation and allow a candidate to be initiated at once. He may grant, in virtue to this, to a sufficient number of Masons the privilege of meeting together and conferring degrees. The lodges thus established are called lodges under dispensation. There has been much misapprehension in relation to this landmark, which misapprehension has sometimes led to a denial of its existence in jurisdictions where the Grand Master was perhaps at the very time substantially exercising the prerogative, without the slightest remark or opposition. The real mode, and the only mode, of exercising the prerogative is this. The Grand Master summons to his assistance not less than 6 other Masons, convenes a lodge, and without any previous probation, but in sight of the candidate, confers the degrees upon him, after which he dissolves the lodge and dismisses the brethren. Lodges thus convened for special purposes are called occasional lodges. This is the only way in which any Grand Master within the records of the institution has ever been known to make a Mason at sight. It is not to be understood by this that any ancient landmark has directed that permanent organization of subordinate lodges which constitutes one of the features of the Masonic system as it now prevails. But the landmarks of the order always prescribe that Masons should from time to time congregate together for the purpose of either operative or speculative labour, and that these congregations should be called lodges. The presence of a master and 2 wardens is as essential to the valid organisation of a lodge as a warrant of constitution is at the present day. The names, of course, vary in different languages. The master, for instance, being called venerable in French Masonry, and the wardens surveillance. But the officers, their number, prerogatives and duties are everywhere identical. The necessity of this law arises from the esoteric character of Masonry. As a secret institution, its portals must of course be guarded from the intrusion of the profane, and such a law must therefore always have been in force from the very beginning of the order. Formerly, these general meetings, which were usually held once a year, were called General Assemblies, and all the fraternity, even to the youngest entered apprentice, were permitted to be present. Now they are called Grand Lodges, and only the masters and wardens of the subordinate lodges are summoned. This is a landmark highly essential to the preservation of justice and the prevention of oppression. A few modern Grand Lodges, in adopting a regulation that the decision of a subordinate lodges in cases of expulsion cannot be wholly set aside upon an appeal, have violated this unquestioned landmark, as well as the principles of just government. This is called the right of visitation. This right of visitation has always been recognized as an inherent right, which injures to every Mason as he travels throughout the world. And this is because lodges are justly considered as only divisions for convenience of the universal Masonic family. Of course, if the visitor is known to any brother present to be a Mason in good standing, and if that brother will vouch for his qualifications, the examination may be dispensed with, as the landmark refers only to the case of strangers, who are not to be recognized unless after strict trial, due examination, or lawful information. This is undoubtedly an ancient landmark, founded on the great principles of courtesy and fraternal kindness, which are at the very foundation of our institution. It has been repeatedly recognized by subsequent statutory enactments of all Grand Lodges. Non-affiliation, which is, in fact itself a Masonic offence, does not exempt a Mason from Masonic jurisdiction. That is to say, a woman, a cripple or slave, or one born in slavery, is disqualified for initiation into the rites of Masonry. Statutes, it is true, have from time to time been enacted enforcing or explaining these principles, but the qualifications really arise from the very nature of the Masonic institution and from its symbolic teachings, and have always existed as landmarks. A belief in the existence of God as the grand architect of the universe is one of the most important landmarks of the order. It has always been deemed essential that a denial of the existence of a supreme and superintending power is an absolute disqualification for initiation. The annals of the order have never yet furnished or could furnish an instance in which an avowed atheist was ever made a Mason. The very initiatory ceremonies of the first degree forbid and prevent the possibility of so monstrous an occurrence. This landmark is not so positively impressed on the candidate by exact words as the preceding, but the doctrine is taught by very plain implication and runs through the whole symbolism of the order. To believe in Masonry and not to believe in a resurrection would be an absurd anomaly, which could only be excused by the reflection that he who thus confounded his belief and his skepticism was so ignorant of the meaning of both theories as to have no rational foundation for his knowledge of either. I say advisedly a book of the law, because it is not absolutely required everywhere that the Old and New Testaments shall be used. The book of the law is that volume which, by the religion of the country, is believed to contain the revealed will of the grand architect of the universe. Hence, in all lodges in Christian countries, the book of the law is composed of the Old and New Testaments. In a country where Judaism was the prevailing faith, the Old Testament alone would be sufficient. And in Islamic countries, and among Islamic Masons, the Koran might be substituted. Masonry does not attempt to interfere with the peculiar religious faiths of its disciples, except so far as it relates to the belief in the existence of God, and what necessarily results from that belief. The monarch, the nobleman, or the gentleman is entitled to all the influence and receives all the respect which rightly belongs to his exalted position. But the doctrine of Masonic equality implies that, as children of one great Father, we meet in the lodge upon the level, that on the level we are all travelling to one predestined goal, that in the lodge genuine merit shall receive more respect than boundless wealth, and that virtue and knowledge alone should be the basis of all Masonic honours and be rewarded with preferment. There is some difficulty in precisely defining what is meant by a secret society. If the term refers, as perhaps in strictly logical language it should, to those associations whose designs are concealed from the public eye and whose members are unknowing, which produce their results in darkness, and whose operations are carefully hidden from the public gaze, a definition which will be appropriate to many political clubs and revolutionary combinations in despotic countries, where reform, if it is at all to be effected, must be effected by stealth, then clearly Freemasonry is not a secret society. Its design is not only publicly proclaimed, but is vaunted by its disciples as something to be venerated. Its disciples are known, for its membership is considered an honour to be coveted. It works for a result of which it boasts, the civilization and reformation of his manners. But if by a secret society is meant, and this is the most popular understanding of the term, a society in which there is a certain amount of knowledge, whether it be the methods of recognition or of legendary and traditional learning, which is imported only to those who have passed through an established form of initiation, the form itself also being concealed or esoteric, then in this sense is Freemasonry undoubtedly a secret society. The Temple of Solomon was the symbolic cradle of the institution. and therefore the reference to the operative masonry, which constructed that magnificent edifice, to the materials and implements which were employed in its construction, and to the artists who were engaged in the building, are all component and essential parts of the body of Freemasonry, which could not be subtracted from it without an entire destruction of the whole identity of the order. Nothing can be subtracted from them. Nothing can be added to them. Not the slightest modification can be made in them. As they were received from our predecessors, we are bound by the most solemn obligations of duty to transmit them to our successors. Not one jot or one tittle of these unwritten laws can be repealed, for, in respect to them, we are not only willing but compelled to adopt the language of the sturdy old barons of England, nolumus leges mutari.
For more Masonic podcasts, videos, music, texts, and artwork, visit fromthequarries.com or subscribe to our YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook accounts by searching From the Quarries.